Welcome to the Cape Town Conversations, the third edition of this dialogue hosted by ORF and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. For the special podcast conversation, we have Philemon Thembu, the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Dialogue in South Africa, and Professor Alexander Surginin, Professor of IR at the St. Petersburg State University in Russia. With these two gentlemen today, we'll be discussing the future of the G20. For both of you, first, let's lay the context. We've had a very interesting chapter of the G20 as a multilateral group come to an end. Four emerging economies, beginning with Indonesia, then India, Brazil, and now South Africa, have concluded their respective presidencies and are now, in a sense, handing the baton over back to the United States, where the grouping essentially began post the 2008 financial crisis. When discussing the future of the G20 presidency, I think we have to address, in a sense, the elephant in the room. President Donald Trump there's been a transfer back or a handover. For those who have been in Cape Town and are familiar with the South African presidency will understand where I'm coming from, that there has been a handover, and I put that in quotes, to the United States. And given the unpredictable nature of President Trump, I think what we can do, in a sense, is just manifest and hope of what the US presidency will look like. So, Philemon, if I want to begin with you, what would you manifest? What would be your utopian outcome of a US presidency of the G20 at a time like today when there is a geopolitical flux, there's food insecurity and supply chain disruptions, of course, geopolitical conflicts? What is your hope? What would you manifest of a US presidency under President Trump of the G20? Over to you, Philemon.
Well, I think the first thing is to note the manner in which they've been participating throughout South Africa's presidency, which has been a bit haphazard. So on some areas, they've been participating, sending delegations, but they've probably taken the finance track more seriously than the Sherpa track. So the first Sherpa meeting of the year, they did not send a high-level delegation. They sent staff members from their embassy to represent them. It fluctuated throughout the year, where in some working groups they were active and in others they were not active. But certainly from our observation, they took the finance track more seriously than the Sherpa track. But also, it's important to note that US institutions were quite active also in the engagement groups. So the Business 20, US businesses were very active throughout the year, irrespective of the position of the administration towards South Africa. And in fact, you had a steady handover from the Business 20 South Africa to the US Chamber of Commerce just last week. And so in that regard, I think it's important to note that when the US is thinking of its role within the G20, it's definitely going to be a much more leaner agenda. They'll certainly prioritize the finance track and probably the leaders track. It's quite also clear that some other areas that may have evolved, throughout time, whether it's the issues of climate change, whether it's equality, those areas will probably have less priority for the United States. And I think what is interesting is obviously they didn't attend, the summit just last week. But I think what was important is that the other members of the G20 endorsed a leader's declaration, despite the protestations from the United States. And so in that regard, I think it sent a signal to the US that the agenda of the G20, whilst the host country does play a key role in setting the agenda, one country cannot derail the overall agenda of the G20. And so I think the focus will certainly be still more on your economic governance issues, financial issues. When it comes to energy, it won't be in the form of renewable energy. Likely, it will be more in the form of, access to all types of energy. So in that regard, there will be certain rollbacks to the agenda. But I think as long as the G20 is hosted by the US, and I think what happened this year was a concerted effort from South Africa to also work with the UK, which is also obviously going to take the presidency after the US. So I think what South Africa was trying to do is to guarantee some degree of continuity, irrespective of some of the rollbacks we might see under the Trump administration.
So, Professor, if I was to ask the same question to you, and Fellaini, I'm glad that you picked up on the finance track, because that is going to be my next question. But Professor, if you were to manifest, if you were to hope, to desire, if you would have 4 or 5 points in a sense that you want the US to accomplish in its G20 presidency, what would those be?
Well, if you look at the arguments which Trump delivered before this summit, and as a justification for not participating in this summit, we've seen that they had several taboos on the agenda for G20. First of all, it's a climate change problematic. Then also diversity, inclusiveness, and equality, which is also not welcome issue on the current Trump administration agenda, and also things like green economy transition, that kind of stuff. So my prediction is that the American agenda for G20 for the next year will be something more practical. Not only finance, but also access to the critical minerals. Things like, for example, promotion of American economic and financial interests in the various regions, and one of the issues which was dissatisfied Trump this year is that there was a clear shift from global governance agenda to Africa interests, and it was unacceptable for him. So I think that the issue will be strengthening American positions throughout the world, and also strengthening those multilateral institutions where the United States has a clear leadership.
Excellent. So very evident from what both of you are saying is that climate, in a sense, we can forget about.
Yeah.
We can forget about equality and justice, which was a very important pillar of the South African presidency, from your vantage point, very justified. And the emphasis is going to remain predominantly on the finance track. And that leads me to my second question. And Professor, maybe we can begin with you this time. There has been an argument for a few years now that by elevating the G20 to the leadership level, have we, in a sense, taken away its core powers, which, in a sense, was the finance track. It was born out of a financial crisis. And maybe it is time to roll back, given geopolitics gets in the way of maybe achieving some of the outcomes that we all collectively want to. We live in turbulent times. There's conflict in many parts of the world, including in this continent, in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia. Are we thinking too short term by saying that maybe because it's President Trump, he has an unpredictable personality, maybe we should look at not a leaders level summit and more focus it on the finance track? Or is that a limiting option? Are we thinking too short term, just one president, so we should roll it back? Or do you think there is merit in the argument that even in the long term, maybe it's time now that the G20 focus more on the finance track, and that might lead to better outcomes? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, from the philosophical point of view, it's always very difficult to say which strategy is more effective, narrowing down the focus of international institution activities or expanding it. Clearly, the last summit, the focus was on prioritizing a number, very few but very important issues for the global South. And if you do that, you can achieve more by focusing on some specific issues. But on the other hand, if you are too narrow in your focus, you can miss something very important, which is looming ahead. Some new challenges and risks, which is difficult to predict right now. And that's why it's very important to be open-minded, flexible, receptive to any fresh ideas, and so on. Of course, I think that American presidency wouldn't be that kind of presidency which will be ready for these open-minded policies. On the contrary, Trump obviously will try to use G20 for promotion of its national interest, to make America great again. No illusions about that. And of course, we should remember that Trump, in principle, like a Republican Party in general, they don't like multilateral formats. They're very suspicious about them. And if they lose control over this or that international institution, they try to impede it, or try to dissolve it, or to sideline from geoeconomics or geopolitics. Yeah. So my general conclusion is that we should just survive American presidency in this institution, and then when more adequate, more reliable countries will be presidents, I guess G20 has a very good resource, very good potential for the future.
Dr. Thembu, your thoughts?
Look, I think, yes, to the one aspect, it's obviously the Trump administration plays a key role when it comes to rolling back an expanding agenda. But I don't think we should attribute that to President Trump, because it's actually South Africa that conducted a review of the G20. It's South Africa that led that review process, the G20 at 20. It had extensive engagements with all the members of the G20. And one of the areas that arose during that review was that we need to look at the expanding agenda and find a balance. Some of the more effective areas of the G20 have been around issues of economic growth, cooperation in the economic space, the financial architecture, looking at debt, issues. So, of course, we've also got other issue areas which have a very clear impact on the economic issues, whether it's technology, whether it's energy. So it is actually South Africa's review and leadership that will actually enable the Trump administration to come up with a more leaner agenda. Now, whether President Trump wishes to acknowledge that or not, I doubt he will acknowledge it. But the reality is that that is one of the legacy areas of the South African presidency. Obviously, South Africa took the presidency after essentially 4 consecutive presidencies of the Global South, and it was important to conduct this review. It was agreed during the Rio summit last year. So it's actually a legacy of the Global South to review the G20 as an institution and see how to make it more effective. Now, the US administration will interpret that and give priority, yes, to the finance track and give priority to the leadership track. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a leaner agenda. It's not necessarily a bad thing to review, I think, the 20-odd working groups and to see which ones need to continue, which ones need to be collapsed, into one another to make it a bit more leaner. Because if every presidency continues to expand the agenda, this is going to have an impact in terms of implementation, in terms of continuity. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it is only 1 year. But certainly I think, other G20 countries will have to find a way of ensuring continuity of certain issues that may not be a priority for the Trump administration.
No, that's a fair point. So of the two questions I've asked, the first one, we can forget about discussing climate change for a year. We'll pick that up when UK picks up the presidency post-Trump. And there is some merit in the argument, and certainly South Africa's leadership deserves much credit for the review it's conducted and maybe streamlining. I think that would be a better way to put it, as opposed to calling it a rollback or downsizing. I think streamlining makes it a bit more efficient as a global grouping. My last question to both of you gentlemen is a hypothetical. Let's do a bit of future gazing. If we were to have the same conversation 1 year from now, are you expecting the G20 as a grouping to survive? Or do you think that this might just be the end of the plurilateral grouping as we imagined it thus far, and it will take a new form? Fellaini, maybe we start with you and give the last word to Professor.
Look, I think it will survive. It will survive. It will certainly evolve. It's gone through the first round of presidencies. It has to evolve. The world has changed when compared to the first leaders, a summit that was held. So it has to evolve. It's still seen as the premier, plurilateral grouping when it comes to economic governance issues. So there is still a need, for an informal grouping that doesn't have a secretariat, not a treaty, not a charter, that can allow countries to cooperate when it comes to economic governance issues and to try and identify, early markers when it comes to any potential challenges that the global economy might be facing. So I do think it will survive, but certainly in a different form, perhaps more streamlined, as you put it. And that is what is going to begin, the next round of the G20, especially in an environment where other multilateral bodies that are more formal in nature, like the UN, like the World Trade Organization, are undergoing, crises, essentially.
Professor?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I agree with my colleague. Yes, of course, the G20 will survive. Maybe the progress, the developments will be slowing down within this institution. But still, as I mentioned, this institution has a very good resource, very good potential. It's accumulated a lot of positive experience, and there will be a continuation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Dr. Thembu. And that's it from this podcast of At the Cape Town Conversations. The verdict, the G20 will survive President Trump. Maybe we see a new avatar of it, more streamlined, more focused, and President Trump will likely take credit for that. But as Dr. Thembu mentioned, much credit goes to South Africa and, of course, the three presidencies preceding that of Indonesia, India, and Brazil, to mainstream development, to mainstream the finance track, and really put an emphasis on economic growth in this plurilateral grouping. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next year.